Hi, Matt Yankovic, Head of Open Source Strategy and the co-host of the Hacking Open Source Business podcast. Today, we're going to dig into the archives and hear from founders on how they have been successful or some of the challenges they've seen around commercializing open source software. It's a huge challenge. Lots of open source startups, lots of companies who are trying to build companies around open source struggle with how they take something that is inherently free and turn it into a viable business model. So, we've asked these founders, we've collected their feedback, and here is some of the best clips and some of the best answers we have. First, we're going to start off with, what are those models? Let's get some open source business model advice from some of these executives, founders, and people who have been successful at this.
I think a lot of companies, new open source companies, they say, I'm going to go and I'm going to, do what Red Hat did. But when I hear that, I usually say, okay, so this is today's open source technology. What's tomorrow's? What's the next thing you're doing? What's 3 years from now? And a lot of companies say like, no, this is my open source technology. And I say, well, that's not Red Hat's business model. So you're not actually trying to be like Red Hat. You're thinking you're trying to be like Red Hat. And that's, again, where I think it comes back to what is the business model that you're actually really trying to create? Because I think you structure your business differently. If someone actually says, no, I truly do want to be a Red Hat, then I think, they think differently about how they're going to contribute to their current open source project versus how they're what's going to be in their roadmap next year for other open source projects you're going to bring in, so forth and so on. Unfortunately, there's also not a crazy amount of answers. It's sort of you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. If you don't open source, the likelihood that you're going to get adoption for a lot of tech is surprisingly low. And if you do open source, you have to figure out that fine line that you don't cross so that you can be the place that everybody comes to get, whether it's support or extra features or a SaaS product for, or whatever it is. I don't have any direct answers other than I think these are the kinds of things that you just have to be very intentional and thoughtful about, and stick to your plan as you go about it versus bouncing back and forth between different models. I think you got to come up with one, you got to stick to it, and you got to keep doing everything you can to get it to the place that is the best for the business, which I, again, firmly believe what's best for the business is what's best for the enterprise as well. As I was saying earlier, if businesses are doing well, I think that's a symbiotic relationship with the enterprises that are taking advantage of the tech, which is often sometimes lost as well.
Yeah, I think on a metrics, in the context of metrics and how long is a sales cycle and how you think about it, I think it's really about segmentation. The same way that a small medium business cycle is going to be a lot shorter usually than an enterprise cycle with a lot less sort of variability. I think the same way with open core, right? It's always about segmenting the different audiences. Some are just going to be like free forever. They're sort of like, nope, we're open source hardcore. Like, we'd rather fork your project and add the spit and glue and get all the features we need, and we never need to talk to you, but thank you very much. And we're fine with that, right? And then we're totally fine with that. There's wonderful customers out there that we spend time with that actually contribute back and are really great parts of the community, and they'll still have a certain take. But a lot of our what we call the ICP, the ideal customer profile, is going to be these enterprises who have these strict regulatory requirements, but still want to be productive. They want to reduce risk. They want to have control of their collaboration. They want to make everyone more efficient. And in that frame, they're always going to buy, right? Now, it's a question of when they're going to buy, but they're always going to buy as they scale, because it's just their model. It's how they consume software. So in those spaces, it turns out to be, it's almost like the take a traditional sales cycle, but kind of move it to the POC, and it's kind of around that stage. And it's going to be very different in our sort of federal business versus our commercial business. It'll be very different for if it's so the variables are going to be, is it a large enterprise, or is it a small medium business, or somewhere in between? Is it a public sector or private sector business? And that'll determine budget cycles. and then it'll also determine sort of use case and culture. So we tend to do the best where if the managers are technical, like we're in, right? If the managers know how to code, they're technical or ex-technical, like that's our sweet spot. So there's a lot of tech giants and wonderful companies out there that are in that sweet spot. There's another one which takes it a longer, but eventually gets there. It's organizations where the developers really like us, but the managers aren't technical and they don't understand why you need something like Mattermost when you have like, oh, there's Microsoft Teams, right? Like I can send emojis there. It's like I can send an Office document, and they're like, why can't you use? Yeah, it's like, oh, this works for me. Like, what's the difference? And then developers get frustrated, and all these. Is all the stuff ensues, and we might get run, and we actually do get run as shadow IT there much longer in those organizations. So that's the kind of segmentation. There's sort of the sweet spot or ideal customer profile and that adoption curve, and those sort of the adoption curve and those characteristics are pretty consistent. And then there's going to be the outliers on both sides, like the free forevers, and then the sort of like a little bit less like the more heterogeneous organizations.
So today, DevStream and DevLake are open source and unmonetized, and that will stay the case for some time. As we've been building the DevLake community and the user base worldwide, we've identified some opportunities to remove kind of the headaches of implementation and management. We've had certainly kind of some of our larger enterprise users ask for more support than makes sense to give for free. And they're happy to pay for it. So we're actually in the process right now of really kind of putting together a product strategy of, what does kind of a managed hosted version of DevLake look like? So we plan to launch that most likely in Q4 of this year, where everyone will still be able to use DevLake for free as it is today. That will remain unchanged, but we will be debuting a paid solution for those who maybe want to go a bit further, get better support, maybe more customization. We're still in the figuring out mode for that.
But your main product is Marico Analytics, right? And that's what most people are purchasing from you today.
That's correct. So yeah, to speak to the relationship there, because there's so many complex pieces of this, and I'll do my best to articulate it simply. So DevStream in a nutshell is our answer to the question of, well, if I don't have a strong DevOps tool chain, how do I get started? DevStream's our answer to that. It's an open source package manager that lets smaller or less mature teams set up, connect, and replicate a great DevOps tool chain. DevLake is the answer to the question of, well, now I've got this tool chain, I've got great processes and a strong team. How do I make sure that we're doing the right things and that our process is working and that we're not running into hidden bottlenecks, and that when we're finding successes, we know why and can scale them? DevLake is the answer to that question. Then we do have our open core proprietary product, which is Dev Insight, which is what we're monetizing today. And that's much more oriented around kind of contribution analysis, code quality signals, static analysis, reports, and kind of permissioning that's more oriented towards kind of the executive user in larger companies. And the relationship between all three of these things, right, is if we execute how we hope we can, and we are today, with DevStream, we'll be helping bring the kind of engineering ecosystem at large up to speed with the latest and greatest with DevOps tooling. With DevLake, we're going to help them to maximize the impact of that and get a complete read on their delivery process. And then our hopeful expectation is that companies that have maximized DevLake are naturally going to want to start looking deeper, right? They're going to want to start understanding, what's actually going on in our code base? How good is our code? Where are there kind of quality concerns or security risks? And, I think if we play our cards right, they will believe in us, they'll trust us, they'll know we know what we're doing. They'll continue using DevLake, and then they'll attach Dev Insights to their process to get a truly complete picture.
Different approaches to monetizing open source, and also deciding that I didn't want to take outside investment because I'd had friends who'd been badly burnt by that. I thought that I would start with the tried and tested model of selling services around open source to begin with. And that would enable me to hopefully make enough money to hire somebody, and then hopefully enough money to be able to then invest profits into experimenting with open source projects ourselves. And then at some point that there would be enough traction in the open source project that we created that I might then get the chance to create a product strategy or a paid for proprietary. So like either a landscape from Canonical World or a MongoDB enterprise feature, around automation or backup, whatever it is, around the project. So I did have a plan that it was going to start with services, hopefully be successful enough with that to create some open source projects, and then hopefully at some point then be able to experiment with products. But it wasn't, Mark had, he'd sold his previous company Thought for $750 million, and MongoDB with Max Schissen, who was the CEO at the time, they just got investment of a couple $100 million. So they clearly had the money to be able to do something slightly different, whereas I knew I was going to have to go through this long journey of kind of testing. But I'd had the experience of selling around all these different models to know that if I took this one small step with a company this way, I might be able to get to the next step, to the next step, to the next step. So I was always hoping to sort of test out the various different models, but it was just going to take a bit longer. But I saw Kubernetes as the perfect vehicle for that, because a little bit like Landscape was the value on top of Ubuntu early days, I saw Kubernetes as being the value on top of the Docker and container ecosystem. So Docker was going to create the market, I thought, but the value was going to be created for companies with the automation and the wrapper around it. And I likened Kubernetes in my head to Landscape at Ubuntu, and then with some of the MongoDB enterprise features around the open source database.
So with open source being free, can you really make money off of open source? Can you build a viable business? Sure, there are some companies that have become unicorns, but that's a very small number. So can you build a viable business and commercialize open source? Let's hear from our executives.
Yeah, you're right, and I think it's interesting thing. Like also in this case, like as you speak about the libraries, right? I think you have to understand there is a sort of like a critical mass of a value, right? What you are getting, right? Which independent on the price gets you to go through all that things you have to do when you're building out contractual relationship, right? Because imagine what you sell here. I want you to sell your library like for 1 cent, right? Well, you know what? It's not meaningful, right? In this case, but you still, if you cannot use it according to, let's say, some open source license, right? That gets all that kind of other, other things, right? What you have to do, right? If you are building that into your software, right? And that may restrict the license and you can use your software for, right? And so on and so forth, right? Which is totally not even kind of related to price, but that, introduces the complexity out there.
As we've grown, I think like any company seeking to grow to great heights, we have large ambitions that are financial, and figuring out how you harmonize that with wanting to also play this kind of open source approach can be challenging. And I won't lie that that we've had it figured out from day one, right? We've vacillated between like looking at different iterations of the open core model, different iterations of the open source model, and really kind of everything in between. And I think what we've found is that we can ultimately kind of get the best of all worlds by doing what we're doing today, which is having a product like DevLake that is 100% open source, will always be 100% open source, and kind of use that as something that's benevolent for the entire ecosystem. Even for the, for our competitors, I think it's benevolent and useful. And that this can ultimately drive the bigger picture for us in many different ways. But I would say for us, kind of going back to, kind of the why open source question that's buried in this, I think one big part for us that we've learned on our journey doing kind of data and analytics driven technologies is that, especially when you're serving, a engineering audience, developers are smart people who want to look under the hood. They're skeptical. If they think that something is maybe doing something incorrectly or hiding something from them, it's going to arouse their suspicions, and rightfully so. So to really kind of put our money where our mouths are, to earn their trust, not just win it, but earn their trust, we knew fundamentally that bringing something truly transparent to the table was going to be critical for our long-term success. So for us, going this open source kind of first pathway has really been our love letter to transparency in many ways. It's been answering this frustration we've seen in the market, littered with many analytics products, where people don't like an opaque solution, they don't like black boxes, they don't like something that they maybe can't trust because they can't see how it's working. What better way to solve for that than going completely open source, completely transparent? So that's really kind of what fundamentally led us to this pathway today.
I think a lot of it is not rocket science, and it's not some new magical playbook. By the way, I think generally the idea of commercial go-to-market playbooks in the world of commercial open source companies is extremely dangerous for really one main reason, which is that as a company goes from an open source project to a product or a set of product experiences, which are things that you charge for, and you have customers paying you money for in order to use them, as opposed to open source where there's this completely permissionless dynamic where everyone's doing anything at any time and you have no information. You often go through a highly evolutionary and iterative way of experimenting with monetization strategies. And I know that sounds like a big complex ball of wax, but it just is what it is. Every very successful open source business that I've studied, commercial open source company that I've studied over the last several years, went through many different ways of iterating on how to attract and acquire their first customers through charging for plugins, services, enterprise version, some version of a cloud service or a managed API. It could have been something more specific like what GitLab does, like this buyer-based open core approach where you have like 3 or 4 different ways of monetizing based on user personas inside of an organization. It could be just like, here's the a la carte enterprise or pro or premium version of each open source tool, and we go and basically identify. HashiCorp did an investor day recently and is really excellent at articulating this for just public market investors today, which is they have this like practitioner end user audience they build and nurture continuously forever. It's not one-time static thing. And then that feeds into accessing a buyer customer persona, which is a different buyer persona and different constituency than the persona of a practitioner or an end user. And the buyer is often a decision maker in an enterprise, or it's a CTO or CIO or a VP of IT or some person with budget and or access to a budget inside of an organization. And they have different sensibilities, different ways of making technology purchase decisions, different ways of understanding the value proposition of products and technology and the impact that those technologies have on their organizations. And so I think that it's very incremental and iterative. Each one of these companies is quite unique in terms of how they monetize, and it takes a lot of humility to kind of understand, exactly as you said, some projects have massive amounts of adoption, and they're really not able to be monetized or commercialized in different ways.
I have always been a believer that for an open source project to grow, what I tell everywhere, wherever I go, that take care of your community will take care of you. That's a simple mantra I follow in the open source, and that has been from the day one till now I've been following. So you can say from the in the very first year, we did any kind of strategy to gain some revenue, okay? Because the very first thing for us that first of all, community should adopt us. We should build a community, right? Because without community, you are nothing for open source, right? So community is like a heart and soul for every open source project. So in the very first year, we were very much focused in building the community. So what I did was that I built a Facebook group, okay? I got the forum online, and then people started joining, questioning on the Facebook group about the Baggy store, and they started coming on forums as well.
When we talk about open source, we often think about community, we think about contributors. And one of the things that is a question is, are there competing interests? Are community and a commercialization strategy at odds with one another? That's a great question, and it's something that a lot of our founders had feedback on. So let's listen to some of the folks who are out in the open source space who have been there, done that, and let's hear from them on, can you have a successful commercial company and a growing community?
I think one of the big lessons that I learned is the don't do any commercialization when you don't have community. So that means because the way how the way how commercialize work is that you need to sell value. And what is the value? Open source is not a value you're selling to customers. Also, open source project itself, it has the value, but it's open source. You're not going to commercialize that. So the way how it works is that you really need to find the signal in the community. So people would use that technology, like that work. So you just keep working on that, bring more functionality into Pulsar and make it attractive, and people start using it. And then at that point, people start asking questions in the community is, do you have a managed service? Do you have a commercial enterprise distribution? I think there's a security feature lacking. Is there any vendor providing that? If people start asking that, then that is the first signal you catch from the community, and that is the time you see people, there's an ask coming into the community asking for commercial, and that is the point that you start looking into how you should build a commercial product. And those initial people who ask questions will become your early adopters of your product. You use the relationship you build in the community to really talk to those users to ask for what they are looking for. Are you looking for Pulsar experts? Are you looking for, you don't have the resources to run a public cloud, and you're looking into a fully managed services? Are you looking into security related features? What are the features that you're looking for? And that is the conversation happening would trigger the company looking into to build the product and find what is the product market fit in order to do the commercial.
I think it wasn't too difficult conversation, to be honest, because we were always clear that we were building this platform for the long run, and in order to do that, we had to build a really good platform that was extremely stable, that had immense developer love. And I think that was always our core goal and our core focus, whether it was internally within the team or externally within the community, or even within our investors. Our core focus has always been like create something that developers out there will really, really love. And until we were absolutely confident that we had something like that, we didn't even want to think about monetization. So I think a lot of it comes down to propagating that belief in what you're building, and just having that alignment with everyone that we are going to continue to kind of build it this way. And I think we've just been very transparent about that. And I think especially with the community, you'd be surprised, but I think the conversation with the community was a lot harder, because there would be so many people who would ask for features like granular access control and audit logs and SSO, and wonder why we're just not building it. And they consistently follow up every the 2 to 3 months and say like, when is this feature launching? And we'd have to be really transparent and just say, hey, I'm sorry, I understand you're a slightly larger organization and team, and you'd see a lot of value from this, but there are all these 20 other features that the large community is just really struggling with right now, and our priorities are there before we can get to this. And being really transparent about that was very, very important for us.
Yeah, so this was a bit weird, because I was actually running my own company business at the time, but it was for something completely different. And I just started like Nextcloud as a hobby, as a side project.
Oh, wow.
Basically.
Okay.
Awesome. I mean, I'm the type of person which always has lots and lots of ideas, most of them stupid, but some are okay.
I always like to tell people I have 1,000 good ideas, 2 of them are good.
Yeah, that's how it is. And I also started all kinds of things over the years, and yeah, this Nextcloud was just one of it. And yeah, but it became clear that I wrote the first version, the 1.0, developed it myself, and then put it on the internet as open source, and then it became like code contributions, and people joined the mailing list, and then they showed up for a meeting, and it was growing, and then the press started to write about it, and the first companies called and said, hey, can we have that? Can we buy support for it, and so on. Yeah. And then it became clear that there's an opportunity to actually do a real company around that.
I was one of the co-founder, but I'm more focused on the kind of engineer and technical side, and is more looking into kind of how we building this end-to-end solution. And I think our mindset there is still when you're building an open source project, the most important thing is the first thing is the you have to really build a community. So before you talking about building product, you have to building a project. So you have to find project community fit. So if you are not able to, not every open source project can build a community. I mean, there's tons of the kind of open source, source available project on GitHub, but not everyone is you able to build a community. So in order to build business, you need to build a project community there. And so at that point, I think we are trying to build this project and community, find a project community fit and try to building a community around that. But I think there's a little bit misalignment between the leadership team, executive team, and the founding team with the investors. There's a certain misalignments into how we want to go to market, and that kind of leads into certain conversation is that we would take an exit on Splunk. So that was a little bit kind of history there. But one learning I get out of this is it's super critical for any open source business is to first build a community. If you don't have a community, don't talk about product, because you don't know how people want to use your software, and then you don't know what exactly the product you're going to build to solve that problem.
I have so much empathy for founders. Just in general, right? I've never had the guts to start my own thing. I've always been really enjoyed supporting founders, but especially now, right? As the markets have changed, and it's really cool, right? Because now I'm on the investment side, so now I evaluate companies through the lens of, can this one day be a big business? Kind of do they have product market fit, right? What's their monetization strategy at some point? When HashiCorp, when we raised our A, we asked investors to give us 2 years. So back in the day, we weren't even thinking about monetization. So we're like, we want to first completely dominate in the open source and get that open source traction. And you see the change, right? So first, you're doing a lot of outbound, right? You're writing content, you're going to meetups, you're speaking, you're doing one-on-one stuff. And at some point, you feel this tipping point where all of a sudden you see that that hockey stick curve, and then as other people are talking about you and other people are sharing, and that's when you right, once you get that kind of peer-to-peer validation and peer-to-peer sharing, that's when you really see kind of this tractions take off. But again, we asked our investors to give us 2 years before we even started to think about monetization, and it's kind of tough now, right? Because to be able to raise a proper A, you have to be at $1 million ARR or show kind of a repeatable sales model that you'll get there. So people just have less time. And it's also interesting, right? Because I've been a community builder my whole career, and now I'm actually telling founders to be like, yes, community is important, but if it doesn't, it has to really directly drive towards what are the business goals and be so closely connected. When in turn, community building is a long game.
All right. So if you do buy into, you can build a viable business and you can have both a great community and a great commercial strategy, the question comes in, how do you measure this? What sort of things are you going to be looking for and tracking when you talk about your growth engine here? Let's hear from executives and some of those guests that we've had on the podcast on what they would measure and what they look for and how to optimize it.
Maybe more than different numbers than that, but I think here it's kind of important to understand, right, is what many of those buyers may get there, right, because there is like a wide adoption in the ecosystem, right? Because you can find solution for everything, right? There is a lot of books, you can recruit engineers and so on and so forth, right? And that means what typically their broad ecosystem helps the monetization. Yes, right, there is of course, let's say some, even in the proprietary software, right? You can say, well, there is this kind of very niche technology, right, which is only used by 5 companies, which are all kind of shell out gazillion money on that, right? And it works, right? But frankly, that is not the market like I understand so much, right? I think I look in this case as kind of open source through adoption and a freemium model, right, if you will, right, where you will have like much more people using the software for free, right, compared to
Yeah.
Yeah, it's something I talk to founders a lot about. Because when we first launched like open source Terraform, our downloads were abysmal. Like it was just like, if you see the first 2 years, it didn't have much traction. And I think that surprises people, because people always look at a company where it is today, right? I think the year before, I watched like Dave McJannet, the CEO's keynote, and he said that all of the HashiCorp tools were downloaded 250 million times. And that's just kind of like a wild number to think about. But with Terraform, we actually scrapped the first version of it. So what we did really early on, and what I tell a lot of founders, is build out a really great kind of user feedback program. So we knew the first 1,000 people in our community by name. We knew them intimately, right? So there's a few things. There were people that were contributing, right? There were those early adopters that were already kind of talking excited. There were kind of like the potential folks that we were reaching out to just to have like open dialogue feedback. So we had a pretty good kind of feedback loop that we were getting feedback. So the first version of Terraform we actually scrapped and rebuilt it, and I think that like surprises people. But yeah, you then start to see kind of so that was one with Terraform, was that like deep connections with those early community members, anyone that even mentioned or had a question, we would do calls, build relationships with. And then we had to also educate a whole market on infrastructure as code, right? So when we launched Terraform, no one actually knew what infrastructure as code was. So Mitchell and Armand for 2 years were just giving basic talks on that like subject. So that's also something interesting, right? If you're defining a new category and changing a way that a developer workflow and introducing a new tool, there's like, I always believe the first pillar of community building is education.
Look at this case, right? One, the question is, of course, is a growth, right? Because in a lot of cases, people say, well, I've built this technology, which is, like a super cool, it can do XYZ things better than other technologies exist on the market, right? But, nobody's using it, right? Well, why is that, right? And how to make them use it, right? And I think that is, to me, that is also goes into some of, what you look at their kind of success marketing, right? Which we hear in the ecosystem, right? Which looks like this kind of like an overnight successes, right? Oh, I built this thing, right? And it was so awesome. I have 1 million people download it, and then success happened, right? But it's often not like that at all, right? I mean, you have like a lot of steps kind of skipped out there.
Yeah, I think a lot of people look at that and they want to be that next fill in the blank overnight success, and they don't realize that there's so many companies that struggle with it for a long time before it clicks, if it ever does.
Well, yeah, and you know what? Like, I like an analogy I heard somewhere from this regard, right? This is like a concept of the chicken, right? Because if you think for like an observer, you have an egg, right? And then one day, right, you have a magic chicken appears of it, right? But if you look at from a chicken standpoint, right, there is a lot of slow and invisible growth, right? How your egg converts into chicken, right? Right, in this case. And I think that is what often happens with those like overnight successes, right? You really need build that kind of chicken, right? Invisible for everybody, right? So things can then pick up, right?
Yeah. Thank you for listening. We hope that this has been educational and beneficial to you. Don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel here, and let us know if there are other topics you want us to ask founders and executives in the open source space.